hadn't been back to my grandmother's cabin in years. It wasn't out of neglect or lack of care. It was just life. You grow up, move away, get busy with work, relationships, and everything else. You always tell yourself you'll visit soon, but soon turns into years. When she passed away, it hit me harder than I expected. I always thought she'd be around forever, sitting in that old rocking chair on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind. Her cabin was left to me in her will. I don't think she ever expected me to live in it, but maybe she hoped I'd take care of it. First, I thought about selling it. It was old, isolated, and needed work, but something in me couldn't let it go. Maybe it was guilt, maybe nostalgia. I don't know. So one weekend, I packed up my truck and made the long drive out there. It was deep in the woods, an hour away from the nearest town. The roads were rough, mostly dirt, and the deeper you went, the more overgrown they became. By the time I reached the driveway, it was clear no one had been there in a long time. The grass was wild, the wooden porch covered in leaves and dirt, and the roof had dark stains from years of rain. The cabin itself wasn't huge, just a single-story structure with a small attic, but it always had a cozy feeling when I was a kid. Now, though, it just looked abandoned. I unlocked the front door, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. Everything was just as she left it. The kitchen table, her favorite chair, the blankets folded on the couch. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning, wiping away dust, sweeping out the dirt. It felt strange, almost like I was disturbing something. The cabin had a way of making you feel watched, even though I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself it was just the silence, the way the trees outside blocked out so much light. After getting things in order, I decided to take a walk around the property. My grandmother had owned a good chunk of land, mostly thick woods. As a kid, I loved exploring out there, finding old deer trails, climbing trees, skipping rocks in the creek a mile back. But as I walked, something felt off. First, it was just little things. A broken tree limb hanging lower than it should, the absence of animal sounds, a faint smell of something rotten in the air. I figured maybe a deer had died nearby. That wasn't uncommon. But as I kept going, the feeling grew stronger, like I wasn't alone. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't old either. The dirt was fresh, slightly damp from the rain a few days ago. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I crouched down, looking closer. The shape was strange. Not boots, not bare feet, just odd, wide, uneven. I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe an old pair of my grandpa's boots that had deformed over time. But I didn't believe it. The more I looked at them, the more I realized they weren't shaped like anything I'd seen before. I turned back, heading for the cabin, walking faster than I wanted to. The woods suddenly felt different, like the trees were leaning in closer, watching. I told myself I was just spooking myself. But when I got back to the cabin, my gut dropped. The front door was open. I knew I had closed it. I was sure of it. I stepped inside, slow, careful. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavier. I checked each room, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Nothing was missing, but something had changed. The blanket on the couch was unfolded now. A chair was slightly pulled out from the kitchen table. I locked the door and sat down, trying to shake the unease. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe I left the door open without thinking. Maybe the wind moved the blanket. But deep down, I knew better. Night came fast. Out here, without streetlights or houses nearby, the darkness was absolute. I had an old lantern, but even that barely cut through the pitch black outside. The forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just stillness. Then I heard it. A soft crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I sat up, my body frozen. Another crunch. Closer this time. I reached for the old hunting rifle my grandfather kept in the corner, my hands gripping the wood tightly. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow, like whoever or whatever. It was wanted me to know it was there. Then they stopped, right outside the front door. I held my breath. Silence. Then the doorknob moved. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't aggressive. It was slow, testing, almost patient. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, but my hands were shaking. The knob turned just slightly, then stopped. The air was thick with tension. My own heartbeat the loudest thing in the room. Then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps. Moving away this time, back into the woods. I sat there for hours, gripping the rifle, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. When morning came, I stepped outside. The grass was flattened where something had stood for a long time, watching. I didn't stay another night. I packed up, locked the place up tight, and left. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to my grandmother's cabin since. Maybe I never will. It had been raining for hours by the time I reached the cabin. The sky was a dark, unbroken sheet of gray, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and wet pine. The gravel road leading up to the cabin had been nearly washed away by the rain, forcing me to take it slow. The tires of my truck skidded once on the slick mud, and for a brief moment, I thought I might not make it. I had rented the place for a weekend. It wasn't much. A small one-bedroom cabin tucked deep into the woods, miles from the nearest town. The listing had said it was an old hunting lodge, long abandoned before being fixed up by the owner. The pictures showed a cozy wooden structure, a stone fireplace, and a porch overlooking a clearing in the trees. It had seemed perfect when I booked it, secluded, peaceful, away from everything. The rain hammered against the windshield as I pulled up in front of the cabin. The headlights illuminated the porch, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The place looked different than the pictures. Older. The wood was darker, more weathered. The windows were streaked with dirt and rain, making it hard to see inside. I turned off the engine and stepped out. My boots sank slightly into the mud, and cold water ran down the back of my neck as I grabbed my bag from the truck bed. The trees around the cabin swayed with the wind, their branches creaking like something alive. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was deafening. I climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The front door was heavier than I expected, and it took some effort to shove it open. Inside, the cabin was dark. The air smelled stale, like wood smoke and something faintly damp. I flicked the light switch, and a single overhead bulb buzzed to life, casting a weak, yellow glow. The inside was just as simple as the listing had shown. A small kitchenette, a couch against the far wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs. In the corner, a stone fireplace, cold and empty. A single door led to the bedroom, and beyond that, a tiny bathroom. I set my bag down near the couch and shrugged off my wet jacket. The rain drummed against the roof, louder now that I was inside. I checked my phone, no service. That wasn't surprising, but I had hoped I might get at least one bar. I moved to the window and looked out. The truck sat just where I had left it, headlights off, rain sliding down its body. Beyond it, the trees stretched into darkness, their outlines barely visible through the downpour. Something felt off. I told myself it was just the isolation, the rain, the way the wind made the trees look like they were moving, shifting. I was just tired from the drive, my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door. I spent the next hour settling in. The cabin had a small generator, but I didn't want to run it all night. I found some old candles in a drawer and lit one on the table. The flame flickered as a draft moved through the cabin. I ate a quick meal from the supplies I brought, a sandwich, some chips. The wind howled outside, and every so often, the rain slammed against the windows hard enough that I half expected the glass to break. I tried reading for a while, but I couldn't focus. The sound of the storm was too loud. The cabin felt too still. Every creak of the wood made my skin prickle. It was just an old cabin settling. That's what I told myself. I decided to turn in early. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a wooden dresser. I changed into dry clothes and climbed under the blankets, leaving the candle burning on the nightstand. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Something had woken me. I lay there listening. The rain had slowed to a steady patter. The wind had died down. Then I heard it. A sound just outside the cabin. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Could have been an animal. A deer. A raccoon. But it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were slow, purposeful. I reached for my phone out of instinct, but there was still no service. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of the trees shifting. Then another step. Closer. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. The candle cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls. My bag was still by the couch where I had left it. My keys were inside. If I needed to, I could make a run for the truck. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the bedroom window. The window was covered by a thin curtain, barely enough to block out the light from the candle. I could see a shape beyond it, a dark outline. Someone was standing there. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no hiking trails, nothing. The figure didn't move. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. Then slowly the shape shifted. A shadow moved across the curtain as whoever it was stepped back. A few seconds passed. Then another sound. The front porch. The floorboards creaked under slow, deliberate weight. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. My truck keys were still on the couch. I had to get to them. Then the doorknob rattled. I stopped, barely a few feet from the bedroom door. The sound was slow at first, then harder. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I backed up, heart hammering. The only thing between me and whoever was on the other side was a flimsy wooden door. Then the rattling stopped. Silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then I heard it again. Not the doorknob this time. The sound of footsteps, moving away. I listened as they made their way down the porch steps, then onto the wet ground. I moved quickly, grabbing my keys and shoving my feet into my boots. I threw the front door open, the wind immediately whipping cold rain against my face. The porch was empty. The trees swayed in the darkness beyond the clearing. Whoever had been there was gone. I didn't wait. I ran for my truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the road ahead. I didn't see anyone, but as I pulled away, my tires slipping on the wet ground, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I drove straight back to town. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that cabin. The owner never mentioned anything strange when I canceled my stay early. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't, but I do, and I'll never go back. I had never been the kind of person who believed in strange things. Superstition wasn't something I ever paid attention to, and I never wasted time thinking about myths or folklore. But some things, no matter how much we try to ignore them, demand to be acknowledged. Some things happen in ways that leave no room for doubt, no space for rational explanations. That was what I learned in the winter of 2018. I was in my early 30s back then, and I had taken a seasonal job maintaining a remote hunting cabin in the Yorkshire moors. It wasn't a fancy lodge, just a simple, sturdy structure used by a group of hunters during the season. The owner, a retired businessman, paid me well to keep an eye on it during the colder months, when the place sat empty. It wasn't a bad deal. The isolation suited me, and I didn't mind the cold. The job was straightforward. I made sure the roof didn't collapse under the weight of the snow, kept the pipes from freezing, and occasionally drove into town to restock supplies. I had a diesel generator for power, a wood stove for heat, and enough food to last me weeks at a time. The cabin sat at the edge of a large clearing, backed by thick, gnarled woods. It was a good half-hour's drive to the nearest village, and the only road leading to it was a narrow, twisting path that turned to deep mud whenever it rained. I had been there for about 6 weeks when things started happening. At first, they were small things, unusual but nothing that I couldn't brush off. One morning, I found strange tracks in the snow around the cabin. They weren't deer or fox prints. I knew what those looked like. These were long and thin, almost human, but with an unnatural length between each step. Whatever had made them had moved in a way that didn't make sense, like it had taken huge, unnatural strides. They circled the cabin once, then led back into the trees. I stood by the door, staring at them, trying to work out what could have made them. A trick of the snow, maybe? A distorted animal track? I didn't know, but I didn't like it. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside. It was a slow, deliberate dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the snow. I lay still, listening, my breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. The sound moved around the building, stopping occasionally, before continuing again. I didn't move. Eventually, it faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind. The next morning, I went outside to check, but the snow had covered any tracks. I told myself it had been a tree branch, broken off by the wind, scraping against the ground as it was pushed along. I didn't believe that, not really, but it was easier to pretend I did. The following week, I went into town to restock supplies. The drive down was slow, the muddy road making it difficult to keep control of the truck. When I reached the village, I stopped by the small grocery store, picking up the essentials: canned food, firewood, fuel for the generator. The man at the counter, an older fellow with a lined face, glanced at me as he rang up my purchases. "Still up at the hunting cabin?" he asked. I nodded. "Best be careful out there," he said. "Strange things in those woods." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sky had darkened, and a thick fog had settled over the trees. The place felt different, heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. That night I heard it again, the dragging sound, but this time there was something else, a whispering just beyond the edge of hearing, low and rhythmic, like words spoken in a language I didn't understand. I didn't sleep. Days passed. The atmosphere around the cabin grew heavier, like a storm building just out of sight. I started noticing other things. Scratches on the wooden walls, too high to have been made by any animal I knew. A smell in the air, musky, rotten, like damp earth and decaying leaves. Then one evening I saw it. I had stepped outside to chop firewood, the axe in my hands, my breath clouding in the cold air. The sky was overcast, the last light of the day barely filtering through the thick clouds. Something moved at the tree line. First, I thought it was a deer, but then it stood up. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and thin, the proportions all wrong. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its head tilted to the side, watching me. I gripped the axe tighter. My heart pounded in my chest. The thing took a step forward, moving in that same unnatural way, covering too much ground in a single stride. I backed up toward the cabin, never taking my eyes off it. My hands were slick with sweat, despite the cold. Then it did something I still can't fully understand. It opened its mouth, wide, impossibly wide, and from it came a sound. A voice. My voice. It repeated something I had said earlier that day. A meaningless phrase, something I had muttered to myself while making coffee. But hearing it come from that thing's mouth in my own tone was wrong in a way I can't describe. I turned and ran inside, slamming the door shut. My hands fumbled with the lock as I pressed my back against the wood, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. For the rest of the night, I sat in the dark, the axe across my lap, listening. I could hear it moving outside, pacing, scratching, whispering. By dawn, it was gone. I didn't waste time. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed my things, loaded the truck, and left. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached the village, I went straight to the store and told the old man I was leaving. He didn't look surprised. "Best not to stay too long in places like that," he said. I never went back. The owner of the cabin sent me an email a few weeks later, asking why I had abandoned the job. I didn't answer. I still think about it sometimes. About the thing in the woods, the way it moved, the way it spoke with my voice. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. Some things are better left alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me and my 2 kids, taking a break from everything. Work had been stressful. The kids were growing up too fast, and I just needed a few days to clear my head. So, I booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was a place I had been to once years ago, but back then I was much younger, and I never really paid attention to how isolated it was. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from any real town. The road leading up to it was long, twisting, and full of potholes. The further we drove, the less it looked like anyone had been out here in a long time. The trees were thick, towering over both sides of the road, blocking most of the daylight. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged to nature more than to people. By the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin was just like I remembered, small but sturdy, with a single porch and an old wooden door. The logs that made up the walls looked darker than I recalled, aged by years of rain and wind. There was a small fire pit outside, a pile of split wood stacked nearby, and a creek that ran just behind the trees at the edge of the clearing. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner on the propane stove, we played a few card games by lantern light, and then we went to bed early. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms and a loft. My kids took the loft and I took the room downstairs. The beds were old, the kind that creaked if you moved too much, but we were tired enough that it didn't matter. It was around midnight when I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The room was quiet. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees outside. I sat up in bed, listening, waiting for something to explain why I had woken up. Then, from outside, I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, slow but steady. I glanced at the window, but the old curtains were thick, blocking my view. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen, waiting to hear if it would stop. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps were gone. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, but I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I went outside, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal or just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. I told myself they were mine, but as I looked closer, I knew they weren't. They were bigger, wider, and led in a slow, wandering path around the cabin. Whoever had been out here had walked the entire perimeter before disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to the kids. There was no reason to scare them. I forced myself to act normal, making breakfast, acting like everything was fine. But the whole time, I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to step out of the woods. We spent most of the day fishing at the creek. The kids had fun, laughing, playing, completely unaware of how on edge I was. I kept my eyes on the trees, listening, watching, but nothing seemed out of place. That night, I made sure the door was locked, checked the windows twice, and kept my flashlight within reach. I told myself the footprints had probably been from an old hunter passing through, or maybe just a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe that. At some point during the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew immediately what had disturbed me. The sound of the front doorknob turning. It wasn't loud, just a slow, steady rattling, like someone was testing it. I sat up, my entire body rigid, my ears straining. The doorknob rattled again. Then silence. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it at the door, but nothing happened. For a long time, I just sat there, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing. But the moment I looked at the ground, I felt my stomach tighten. More footprints. This time, they didn't just circle the cabin. They led straight up to the front door. I woke the kids, told them we were leaving early, and started packing up. I didn't tell them why, just that I had changed my mind. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, back at the cabin disappearing into the trees. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone, standing just at the edge of the woods. But by the time I blinked, they were gone. I never took my kids back to a cabin again. I had never planned on spending the night in that cabin. It wasn't supposed to be part of the trip. I was in Italy for a short vacation, taking time away from everything back home. Life had been too busy, too overwhelming. I needed quiet. I had rented a car and was driving through the countryside, stopping in small villages, exploring places that weren't crowded with tourists. I wanted to get away from people, from noise, from responsibilities. The region I was driving through had endless rolling hills, thick forests, and winding roads that twisted through the mountains. It was beautiful, but also isolated. Most of the time, I didn't see another car for miles. The further I drove, the smaller the roads became. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. My GPS had no signal and I couldn't read the old road signs. I kept driving, hoping I'd eventually find a main road again. That was when the storm rolled in. The sky darkened fast. Heavy rain started falling, and the road became slick. My headlights barely cut through the mist that had settled over the hills. I tried to drive carefully, but the road was narrow, the turns were sharp, and there were no guardrails. The last thing I wanted was to slide off the edge of a cliff. Then my car sputtered. The engine stuttered, then completely died. I pulled over to the side of the road, but there wasn't much of a shoulder, just a steep drop on one side and thick trees on the other. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered weakly before going dark. The battery was dead. I sat there for a while, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield, trying to figure out what to do. There was no cell service. No cars had passed me for at least an hour. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest village. I had no choice but to get out and walk. I grabbed my rain jacket, locked the car, and started walking. The road was empty, stretching endlessly through the trees. My shoes sank into the mud, and my clothes were soaked in minutes. The wind howled through the hills, and the rain was relentless. I kept moving forward, hoping I'd find a house or at least a sign of civilization. That was when I saw the cabin. It was an old stone building, set a little ways back from the road, hidden behind thick trees. A narrow dirt path led up to it. It didn't look abandoned. There was a light in one of the windows. Smoke curled from a chimney. Someone was home. I hesitated, but I didn't have many options. I needed shelter. I walked up the path and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to turn away when I noticed the door was slightly open. Just a crack. The wind must have pushed it open. I hesitated, but then I stepped inside. The cabin was small. Just one large room with a fireplace on one side and a small bed in the corner. A wooden table stood in the center, covered in papers. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood. The fire was burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Someone lived here, but there was no sign of them. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the space. I didn't want to just stand there dripping water onto the floor, so I stepped inside further, hoping to find a phone or something. Then I noticed the papers on the table. They weren't in Italian. They weren't in any language I recognized. They looked handwritten, scrawled in a rough, uneven script. Some pages had diagrams, maps of the hills outside. Others had lists, names, dates, locations. Something about them unsettled me. I looked around again. There were no personal items. No clothes, no dishes, nothing that suggested someone actually lived here. Just the fire. And then I noticed the smell. Not the wood smoke. Something else, something metallic. Blood. It was faint, but it was there. I turned back toward the door, and that's when I saw him. A man stood in the doorway, blocking my way out. He was tall, soaking wet from the rain. His clothes were dark, heavy. His face was pale, shadowed under the hood of his coat. His eyes dark, sunken, locked onto mine. I froze. I hadn't heard him approach. He didn't move. I took a step back. The fire crackled behind me. The rain pounded against the roof. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My breath was shallow, my hands clenched into fists. Then he took a step forward. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted for the other side of the cabin, crashing into the table, knocking the papers to the floor. I grabbed the first thing I could, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. I turned, ready to swing, but he was gone. The door was still open, the rain slashing through the night. I listened, my breath ragged. I could hear nothing over the storm. I had to get out. I moved fast, keeping the iron poker in my hand. I stepped onto the dirt path, glancing around, trying to see if he was still out there. Then I saw the footprints. Fresh, deep footprints in the mud, leading from the trees to the cabin. But not away from it. I ran. I sprinted down the road, slipping in the mud, not looking back. The rain blurred my vision, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. Car was coming. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. The car slowed, then stopped. An older man rolled down the window, saying something in Italian. I didn't understand, but I didn't care. I just pointed back toward the cabin, shaking my head. He must have understood something was wrong. He motioned for me to get in. I didn't look back until we were miles down the road. I never found out who that man was. The police found my car where I left it, but they never found the cabin. They said there was no cabin out there. Nothing but trees and empty hills. I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't supposed to see it. It wasn't my cabin. I didn't build it. I didn't buy it. But for 6 months, I lived in it. The place belonged to an old friend of my dad's, a guy named Joe. I barely knew him, but my dad vouched for him. He needed someone to look after his property while he worked a job in Texas. I needed a place to stay. It worked out. The cabin was deep in the valley, miles away from the nearest paved road. You had to drive 20 minutes down a dirt path to get to it. I had an old truck, beat up but reliable, and I kept it parked near the porch. The land around the cabin stretched out for miles. Dense trees, rolling hills, and a creek that cut through the back of the property. It was quiet out there, too quiet. The first couple of weeks were fine, peaceful. No traffic, no people, just the sound of birds during the day and crickets at night. I'd sit on the porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the fog settle over the valley. In the evenings, I'd listen to the wind move through the trees. There was something calming about it. Then little things started happening. I'd wake up to find the front door unlocked when I was sure I locked it. Tools in the shed would be in different places. A chair on the porch moved just a little. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had left the door unlocked by accident. Maybe I forgot where I put the tools. Maybe the wind moved the chair, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk with steady, deliberate steps. I reached for my flashlight and my hunting rifle. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and careful. They stopped at the porch. I held my breath. Then, after what felt like forever, they started moving away. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the dark with my rifle across my lap. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be a deer, a bear maybe, something big enough to sound like footsteps. But I didn't really believe that. A few days later, I found tracks in the dirt near the cabin. Boot prints. They led from the trees, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. I didn't tell anyone. I should have, but part of me didn't want to admit that something was wrong. I started being more careful. I triple-checked the locks every night. I made sure my rifle was loaded. I kept a flashlight and a knife next to my bed. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. I started to relax. Then, one evening, I went down to the creek to fish. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. The air was cool. I sat on a rock, watching the water, waiting for a bite. Then I saw something. Across the creek, on the other side, someone was standing between the trees. Not moving, just standing there. I froze. They were too far away to see clearly. A man, I thought, tall, wearing dark clothes. I stared at him. He stared back. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the trees. I grabbed my gear and went straight back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. Morning came. I thought about leaving, but the truck was low on gas, and the nearest station was over an hour away. I told myself if something else happened, I'd go. Something else happened. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was soft, slow. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for my rifle. My hands were shaking. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to sit up. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the window. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, listening to the silence outside. Then I heard the front door handle turn. It was locked. Whoever was out there tried again. Then, slowly, they moved around the cabin, testing each window. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came. I checked the property. Footprints. More of them. Someone had been watching the cabin. Getting closer. I was done. I packed my bags, loaded my rifle, and got in my truck. The road out of the valley was long and rough. The whole drive, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road. I never did. I never went back. Joe called me a few weeks later, said he got back to the cabin and found the place in perfect shape. Nothing missing, nothing broken, but he mentioned something strange. He said there were tracks around the property, boot prints, leading from the trees, circling the cabin, then disappearing into the woods. I never told him what happened, and I never looked back. It was early October when I took the job. The man I worked for had a property deep in the woods, an old hunting cabin that needed repairs before the snow came. The pay was fair, and I didn't have much else going on, so I said yes. I packed up my truck with tools, extra clothes, and enough food to last a few weeks. The drive out there took most of the day. At first, it was highways and small towns, then winding back roads through thick trees. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I found myself on a dirt path, bumping over rocks and potholes. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The place was isolated, surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. The nearest town was over an hour away. The owner had warned me it was remote, but standing there, staring at the dark woods stretching out endlessly, I realized just how alone I was. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It was a single-story place with a pitched roof and a covered porch. The logs were weathered, the windows streaked with dirt. There was a woodshed off to the side, half full of chopped logs. An outhouse stood a short walk away, tilted slightly from years of frost heaving the ground beneath it. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had mailed me. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated the wooden floorboards, and the furniture was covered with white sheets. I set my bag down and walked through each room, checking for leaks or damage. The kitchen was small, with an old propane stove and a hand pump for water. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner of the main room, its chimney running up through the roof. The first night was quiet. I cooked some canned soup on the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and read by lantern light until I got tired. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making the branches creak. I fell asleep listening to it, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. The next day, I got to work. The porch steps needed replacing, the roof had a few weak spots, and the shed door barely hung on its hinges. I spent the daylight hours hammering, sawing, and hauling wood. It was good, honest work, and by evening, I was too tired to feel uneasy about being alone in the woods. That changed on the third night. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside, a crunching sound, footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate. I sat up and reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, I didn't move. The only sound was my own breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard a rustling noise, like something moving through the brush. The sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. I half expected to see footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered close in the night. That evening, I made sure to lock the door and prop a chair against it. I kept my flashlight within reach. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. A slow, scraping noise, like nails against wood. I held my breath. The sound moved from one wall to the next, circling the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding. The scraping stopped near the front door. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see anything clearly. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I didn't go outside to check. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When morning came, I forced myself to look around the cabin. This time, I found something. Near the porch steps, a single footprint was pressed into the damp earth. Not a boot print, not an animal track, a bare footprint, human, but the toes were wrong. They were too long, too thin, and they curved slightly like claws. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just distorted by the rain. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, stayed inside after dark, and listened for any sound beyond the walls. The woods felt different now, watchful. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching toward the cabin like fingers. Then, on the fifth night, something happened that made me pack up and leave. Started just after midnight. I heard the footsteps again, moving around the cabin. Slow, patient. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The rattling stopped, replaced by a long, slow scraping sound. Claw-like fingers dragging across the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window, and that's when I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass, staring in. The features were almost human but stretched, distorted. The eyes were too big, the mouth too wide. The skin was pale, almost gray, and the thing's breath fogged up the window. I didn't move, couldn't. Then, without warning, it smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that showed too many teeth. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my keys, and didn't bother packing. I ran straight to my truck, yanked open the door, and started the engine. As I backed up, my headlights swept across the trees, and for a brief second, I saw them. Not just one. Several figures standing just beyond the tree line. Watching, I didn't stop. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, barely keeping control as the truck bounced over potholes. I didn't look back. I reached the main road just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I drove until I reached town, booked a room in the first motel I found, and locked the door behind me. I never went back to that cabin. The owner called me a week later, asking why I left the job unfinished. I lied, told him I had an emergency and couldn't stay. I didn't tell him about the footprints, or the face in the window. I didn't tell him about the things in the woods, watching, waiting, and I sure as hell didn't tell him about the smile.